Okay, so where last we met and discussed social psychology, we were talking about automaticity. And automaticity is an area of research which is really blown up in social psychology and specifically in psychology over the last 10, 15 years. And it's an area that is aligned again. I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to press buttons for a while here. It's aligned against the Cartesian view of human rationality, the Cartesian view of the mind, which says that we think rationally, that our thinking is deliberate and controlled and conscious and logical, and that's a pretty silly set of ideas. And what we found is a variety of researchers, such as Nisbet and Wilson, but also our own Berkeley graduate Sam Gosling, have been doing a lot of research on the limitations of introspection and the limitations of conscious controlled thought, showing that not only is it the case that we have limited access, limited understanding of the real causes of our behaviors, but furthermore, these behaviors are going on, or the causes of them are going on outside of our awareness, outside of consciousness. It's not just that we unreliably report the causes of our behavior, it's that they never even really happened in consciousness. So the biggest person associated with automaticity is this researcher, John Bargh, who is a very smart social psychologist at NYU, who was the mentor to a whole generation of social psychologists who wanted to be on the cutting edge of this research. And one of those social psychologists is our own Serena Chen here in the psychology department, whose social psychology class is outstanding, and I would highly advise that you take it if you haven't already. John Bargh, psychology professor at NYU, leading figure associated with automaticity. And the key factors of what automaticity is, what automatic thinking is that it's automatic. Don't use the word in the definition unless you're a professor, in which case you're allowed to do anything you want, really. That it's non-conscious, that you are unaware of the thought processes, and that it's effortless. It's also, I guess I don't say it here, but it's also fast. And people have often referred to automatic, non-conscious thinking as fast, cheap, and out of control, like the Errol Morris documentary, in that it's a type of cognitive processing and thinking that happens really quickly. It doesn't require much cognitive resources. You can do it all day without becoming tired, unlike conscious, controlled thinking. And it's outside of your control. It's outside of your awareness. You don't know that you're doing it, and you can't direct it. If you try to stop yourself from having some kind of reflex or instinctual behavior in some setting, it's very difficult. You have a limited capacity to regulate your non-conscious processes with your conscious self. So let's see here. Okay. One of the things we talked about Bargh, Chen, and Burroughs 96, which had 3 kind of stunning demonstrations of the extent and strength of automatic effects, of priming effects, showing that you can prime constructs like the concept of the elderly or the concept of rudeness, and people will actually walk slower or behave more rudely. And then we talked about, well, how far can you push this? And we talked about Dijksterhuis. Half of you weren't here last time and just think I'm insane. We talked about Dijksterhuis and von Nippenberg, who did a series of studies that really pushed these priming effects even further, I would argue. And Dijksterhuis and von Nippenberg showed that if you prime people with the concept of professors, they actually answer more trivial pursuit questions right, almost as though they got more knowledgeable or better or increased their memories or somehow were more motivated or better able to access their memory, which is a bizarre and amazing result. Let's see here. Where is Guernica again? Okay, Madrid. Good. We're all agreed on that now. Okay. Then we talked about self-esteem priming, which showed that you can subconsciously prime people with the words I and good, or, well, the Dutch equivalents of those, and their self-esteem will actually increase for some period of time afterwards because you've conditioned an automatic association between the self and positivity, which is essentially what implicit self-esteem is that automatic association and its strength. And then where last we had left off, we were looking at yet another study that tries to push the boundaries of these effects, tries to push the unconscious thought, unconscious decision-making bar even a step higher. And this research asks the question, well, okay, I'll tell you what. This asks the question, how good is non-conscious thought? You know, I've shown you all these things where with little subtle primes that are maybe inside of your awareness or outside your awareness, that are either subliminal or supraliminal, that these little primes can affect your behavior in interesting ways. And I even showed you research showing that it can increase your apparent mental capacities, making you more knowledgeable or more successful on a trivial pursuit. But how far can this go? What about the kinds of things we think of as sort of rational, reasoned decision-making processes? Is it the case that there's a substantial non-conscious component to these decision-making, these rational decision-making processes? And is it the case that maybe under certain circumstances, we're better off relying on our non-conscious reasoning faculties? Maybe they're superior under certain circumstances to our conscious reasoning. And that's something that Dijksterhuis was interested in 2004. Yeah, I'm going to keep doing that. Okay, so what Dijksterhuis did was he presented participants, these were Dutch participants, with information on 4 hypothetical apartments. He was thinking, well, what is a conscious, reasoned, logical, what's the epitome of a decision that college-age people are making that they think is something that's best done consciously, that they think they do totally consciously and logically and rationally, and reason this out. And he said, well, going and getting a new apartment. When you go get a new apartment, you go out and you sort of assess a few options, and then you weigh the costs and, costs and benefits, and you say, all right, I'm going to go with that apartment because it's closer and the rent's lower, even though I have to live with a very, very scary person to live there. These sorts of decisions we make all the time in Berkeley, right? So, or anywhere. So apparently they make the same decisions in the Netherlands. So what he was interested in is, to what extent would non-conscious thought make these decisions better? And this is how he approached that. He presented participants with information on 4 hypothetical apartments. And each apartment had 12 attributes. So, its rent, how well kept up it was, were utilities included, would you have to have a roommate, how many rooms. If you think about it, there's at least 12 bits of information that you get on most apartments before you make the decision to choose it or not, right? And these attributes were presented in random order on the computer screen for 4 seconds each. So there's, 4 times 12 attributes that are presented on the screen, and it would say, apartment B, $650 a month. So, well, that would be nice. Apartment B, like $900 a month or something like that. And apartment D, this many square feet and this many rooms, and so on. And it would appear on the screen for 4 seconds, and then it goes away and a new one pops up. And that goes away and a new one pops up 48 times. Now, if you think about that, that's pretty tough, right? I mean, that would be a pretty tough task to try to figure out what's your favorite or what's the best apartment, right? It's just you're getting hit with a lot of information. But Dijksterhuis reasoned that this is actually not that different than your actual apartment buying scenario, right? You show up at the apartment, you look at it, you've got maybe 5 bits of information in your head from Craigslist, you gather more information from looking at it, you're trying to weigh all the time, how did I feel in the other place, how much did it cost, how much does, the paint being a little bit fresher here, is that worth, $40 in rent a month, you're trying to weigh all this stuff, and it's very complicated, and that's a very typical decision-making scenario. Maybe some of you remember when you decided what college to go to, you had very similar, well, no, actually, it was a very easy decision for all of you because you're here at Berkeley, and that's the best university in the world. So, okay. Bad example. Maybe there was some other decision that was very difficult for you. Certainly not your decision to come here. So, they rigged the game so that apartment 2 was the best apartment. It was superior on, 7 or so of the criteria, and the criteria were preset. The ones that it was superior on were pre-established to be ones that really resonated with these students. And so, on pre-testing, everybody was like, when they could carefully look at it in a spreadsheet and stare at it as long as they wanted, they were like, yeah, apartment 1 is the best. It's the cheapest, it's the biggest, etc. So they rigged it so apartment 1 was the best. And they also rigged it so that 4 was the worst. With 4, it costs, like $1,200 a month. It's really far from campus, and your roommate, is an axe murderer or something like that. So then apartments 1 and 3 were rigged to be, somewhere in the middle and about equal. And again, they tested this by showing it to some people ahead of time, said, okay, take as long as you want to look at this. You can look at all the information. You look at it 10 times, and you make the call, which one's the best, which one's the worst, and so on. And that confirmed their intuitions that they had successfully rigged apartment 2 to be the best one and 4 to be the worst one. So they then had the participants in the study rate each apartment's desirability on a 1 to 10 scale after getting these 48 pieces of information about the 4 apartments. And there were 3 conditions in the study. You're probably at this point like, wait, what's the experiment? There's no experiment. There's no manipulation or independent variable. Well, here was the manipulation of the independent variable. 3 conditions. In one condition, they had to give the 1 to 10 ratings of the desirability of the 4 apartments immediately after the presentation of the 48 bits of information. So you're just being flashed, the 48 bits of information, 4 seconds each, and then it's over, and they're like, okay, give your 1 to 10 ratings right now. And you don't have any time to think about it at all. In the second condition, you're allowed to think. It's the conscious thought condition. You're given 3 minutes to consider what you want to say, what kind of ratings you want to give for these 4 apartments. So in this one, you would expect you would do better, right? You have all this time to think about it. Then they had another condition that was an unconscious thought condition. And in this condition, you're given 3 minutes to think about it, but you're given 3 minutes for your non-conscious to think about it. You're actually consciously totally distracted by a heavily taxing task that you do for 3 minutes after getting all this information about the apartments. And that task is a two-back task, which is something you're all familiar with because it's a very fun game to play. And yeah, so anyway, okay, so the two-back task, how does that work? The two-back task, it totally taxes your conscious reasoning. The way it works is you're shown a series of numbers, 0 to 10 or 0 to 9 single-digit numbers, and they're in a series, and you have to indicate if the one that you're seeing is the same as the one that was 2 back in the sequence, and so you press yes or no. It's pretty hard. They have even harder ones like the 3-back task or the dreaded 4-back task, and no one has ever survived that game. But the 2-back task is pretty tough because you have to be like, okay, that was 7, and then it was 3, and then that's 7, yes. That's 4, no, that isn't 3, and then that's another 7, yes. Then that's 3, I have no idea what the right, I lost it already, And people mess it up, and they try very hard to do well, and it's very challenging. So in the 2-back task, you play this for 3 minutes, and you really can't dedicate any conscious thought to the task at hand. You really can't dedicate any conscious thought to what's the best apartment. You've been fully distracted consciously, but presumably your non-conscious is still allowed to process this information. So, what are the results? Well, what do you think the results would be? Which condition out of these 3 do you think they would be most accurate in assessing the quality of the apartments? The first one, the immediate decision one, the snap decision. And that's sort of the punchline from Blink, right? From Malcolm Gladwell's Blink. It's that in lots and lots of circumstances, it's the immediate, just your immediate initial reaction, your reaction to that thin slice of the videotape, that gives you maybe your best answer in some domains, or it gives you most of the information you'll ever use. Anybody else have a different prediction? Okay, so some people say the third one. Yes. All right, well, let's see who's right. Okay, so here's how they did it. They took your ratings of the best apartment and the worst apartment and subtracted them. They made a different score. They threw out the 2 in the middle and then subtracted your 1 to 10 rating of the one that we know is the best one they subtracted the 1 to 10 rating of the one we know is the worst one from the one that we know is the best one. And that's essentially a measure of how much higher did you rate the one that we know is the best than the one that we know is the worst. And you would want that number to be higher if you're going to be accurate, right? You should be able to identify which one's the best. So the different scores, in general, people didn't do that good a job. It's a really, really tough task. You're given 48 bits of information, in a pretty short period of time, in like 3 minutes or so, and people didn't do very well. Their different scores were above 0, which they ought to be. If they had no ability to do this task, they'd be at 0. But they had some ability to do the task, and so they're a little bit above 0. And in the immediate decision and conscious thought conditions, they did about the same. Not very well, but about the same. Basically, giving an answer immediately that was just as accurate as having 3 minutes to think about it. Which is kind of interesting, right? That, given extra time for conscious thought, they didn't actually improve in their answers. But in the unconscious thought condition, the participants did much better. They actually, the difference score was more or less 3 times the size of here, and it was a highly significant difference, very big effect size. Subjects in the third condition, where they're given 3 minutes to think about it, but not think about it in the sense of that we think of when we think of thinking. When we think of thinking, not like that, but like like thinking, like not thinking, but just thinking. So unconscious thinking, where you're fully distracted, and the only way you can think about it is processing somewhere in the back of your mind, your non-conscious realms and reaches of your brain. Okay, and then they replicated that in a study 2. They found again that unconscious thought condition led to the best decisions. So, what's the conclusion from this study? Well, for certain kinds of decisions and evaluations, unconscious thinking is better than no thinking or snap judgment thinking or conscious thinking. That for some reason, they were able to better puzzle out the right answer or better approximate the right answer when their conscious thought didn't get in the way. Now, why is this? Well, possibly because in your conscious thought, you latch on to certain variables. You attach great significance to, and you reason through, and you try to make a reasoned answer. But you can't hold all 48 bits of information in your brain at once. Now, that's something that your non-conscious thought is very good at doing. You know, when your non-conscious is absorbing thousands of bits of information in this, this very moment, stimulus from your environment, things you're hearing, things you're seeing. Your non-conscious thought is terrific with like lots and lots of information that's presented very briefly. Your conscious brain is very bad at this. Consciousness handles that sort of information presentation very badly. So in a sense, this task is tailored perfectly for the non-conscious to do better than the conscious. What was more of a revelation about this study wasn't so much that there's certain kinds of tasks where consciousness gets in the way, that there's certain kinds of tasks that are better tailored for non-conscious thinking. What was more a revelation of this study was that non-conscious thinking would improve given time. Because we usually think of non-conscious thought as, fast, cheap, and out of control. If you're going to get a good non-conscious thought, it's going to happen quickly, like the thin slices research, right? Where you make that judgment about somebody in that first couple seconds, and you don't change it that much after that. That the snap judgment, is as good as subsequent non-conscious reasoning would be. What was a revelation about this study was that, for whatever reason, 3 more minutes helped them make a better decision. Perhaps just because of the total amount of data that was fed into their brains. So, one takeaway from this is, for important or complex decisions in life, it might be best to sleep on it. And this research has often been noted as an example of the sleep on it effect. That if you have to make some big decision, like where you want to go to graduate school, what job you want to take, what restaurant you want to go, big important decisions, Do you want a burrito or do you want curry? You got to make these decisions. You got to make them right, And it might be best to think on that. Okay, to sleep on it, sorry. Questions? Just hands, yes.
So this applies to multiple choice tests where professors are like, choose your first gut feeling and don't reason through it, otherwise you change your answer and most people will you off.
Is this like that?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's very interesting because we're going to talk about that. Okay, so the question is this like the how people will tell you go with your gut instinct on multiple choice tests, don't reason it through, don't go with like a later answer. This is very similar to that in that research suggests that's totally bogus advice and that you actually should go with your later thinking, not your like gut instinct, given the choice, given that if you had equal kind of credibility invested in both choices, you'd be better off going with the thought you had later than the one you had right off. And we'll talk about, I think, Thursday, we're going to talk about research on that. So I'm so glad you brought that up. She's a plant. She's not really in this class. I placed her there to ask that question. Yes. Yes. Okay, yes. So the larger question might be, when is, deliberative, time-consuming, non-conscious thought better than conscious thought or snap decision-making? It's not entirely known. To a certain extent, this study was thought of as sort of like a discovery study, like an existence proof, that there would be certain conditions under which giving some time to non-conscious reasoning would lead to the best possible decision amongst the various ways you could think about things. And so it's not really known exactly what the boundaries of this effect are. But I'm going with your hunch as well that most likely the boundaries that this study suggests anyway are for information where there's lots and lots of stimuli that's presented pretty quickly and you have to try to hold it all in order to make the best decision. Under those conditions, consciousness will probably get in the way more than help, and your non-consciousness actually could use a little bit of time to make a better decision. Other questions? Yes? Yeah, well, this is why taking time and sleeping on a paper could lead to a better paper. It's something I do all the time, and it takes me forever to get my papers out, but like I'll like say, okay, I want to sleep on that and think about that. And in a lot of ways, and there was this one like famous computer scientist who really espoused this idea. In a lot of ways, if you want to be really creative, you should manipulate this effect to your advantage. You should be aware of this effect. And what you want to do is foster the conditions of creativity by putting all this information in your mind and then sleeping on it for a little while, thinking about it. And what you'll find is that your creative ideas, these new ideas you have, will pop into consciousness. There's this novelist, Arthur Koestler, or Koestler, anyway. He wrote a book called Sleepwalkers, where he documented the discovery process of great scientists in history. And what he found was, it wasn't the picture people thought it was at all, where people would consciously reason things out, where somebody would say, oh, okay, so we know this about the law of gravity, but then we know this about the speed of light, therefore it directly implies the theory of relativity. That's not really how it happens. Instead, the way it tends to happen is it pops into consciousness. Scientists and philosophers would suddenly become aware of an insight that they had generated outside of awareness, and then they would try to justify and translate that into a piece of good science. But that the actual discovery process is not one of conscious reasoning. Instead, it was more of sleepwalking into a great finding or a great discovery. Yeah. So why is it during the two-back task that your unconscious isn't also occupied during the two-back task? Now, I would say it probably is a little bit. It probably is. There probably is some non-conscious thought being dedicated to the two-back task, but not, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. You would think that at least some would be. But I think that the positive benefits of it totally impairing conscious thought overwhelm the slight impairing on non-conscious thought, if that makes sense. I think in some ways you could look at this study as a study showing the detrimental effects of conscious reasoning in certain domains, not so much the superiority of non-conscious thought. Because technically they can also do non-conscious thought in the other condition. They're probably just trumping it with their conscious thought, Yes?
Is there a certain amount of sleep, or what would be the normal amount of sleep for the non-conscious to start working?
Totally unknown. How much did you sleep in order to generate these better decisions? Or I don't know. You'd have to ask a sleep researcher. They'd know better than me. Yeah. In this case, they weren't even technically sleeping, right? They were just spending 3 minutes doing the very, very thrilling two-back task, which is different from sleep. Though they suggest that it implies the sleep-on effect. Okay, one more question, then we'll move on. There was one over here. Yes.
Well, I had a response to that before.
Yeah.
Like, the non-conscious can do so very many things that the back task is probably nothing.
That's true. Yeah. Right. Okay. The point would be, yeah, maybe the non-conscious processing is so powerful and can handle so many bits of information, it may not be impressed with the two-back task. It's like, oh, I am not impressed by the two-back task. You're not. I can easily handle this and make the correct apartment choice. So, have you guys ever seen the Pumping Iron, that old documentary with Arnold Schwarzenegger in it and stuff? Man, that's like the most hilarious documentary. I think of it in the most inappropriate circumstances. There's this one point where he's like at some like media event with all the other guys that are in the Mr. Universe contest, and they're interviewing everybody, and they're like, Arnold, do you think you'll win? And he's like, oh yes, I do not know why my competitors have even shown up. They have already finished second. It's so funny, man. And that guy's my boss, and that's on webcast. So, okay. I won't be here on Thursday. So if you want to harness the sleep-on effect to your advantage, or the Arthur Koestler, I got to look up how to pronounce that guy's name, sleepwalker effect to your advantage, and you're in an area, a professional or an academic domain where your creativity is, your bread and butter, then what you want to do is fill your brain, treat your brain like a garden, where you fill it with all the right ingredients and then let things grow up and then kind of cherry pick the good ideas that pop into consciousness and have this mentality. And remember that some of the things that make creativity happen are stuffing all the right information in your head, getting new information in some area that you're trying to be creative in, getting some new angles and some new stuff, stuff it in your head, have productive conversations with people. That's really good for creativity as well. because it's like stuffing new information in your head. You coordinate yourself to other people's perspectives. And when you see things through multiple perspectives, you're more likely to be creative. What else can you do? You can, you can try to focus on the problem, too. You can just be sure that when you go to bed or when you leave work, that the thing you're thinking about is the thing you're trying to make progress on. And this is why putting people, creative people, in the same environment with one another so they can start talking about their ideas with each other can often be a very good way to create creativity, because you coordinate yourself to other people's perspectives, you're forced to think about the thing that you're thinking about, and it brings it to the front of your mind. So these are ways in which you can stimulate your mind to be more creative. Even though it would seem impossible to manipulate your non-conscious, you can indirectly by fostering its productivity. Okay, so some larger conclusions about automaticity. Unconscious thought is fast, uncontrolled, automatic, outside of awareness. Conscious thought is controlled, effortful, deliberate, intentional, slower, and inside awareness. Behavior and thought can become unconscious via repetition. This is a very important one. This is very important to remember that that which is automatic that you do now was probably once conscious and controlled. Or most of the things that you do automatically, like reading, sentence construction when you're talking to people, riding a bike, taking notes, typing, all that stuff was at one time a conscious control process where you had to think about every bit of it. And now, you remember there was a time when you didn't even know how to use silverware. You didn't know how to hold a pencil, And all that stuff is second nature to you now. It goes on automatically. And it still requires just as many synapses to fire to do it. It still happens. Your brain still has to create cognitions that give rise to that behavior. You just do it fluidly, effortlessly, and non-consciously. And when you realize that, you realize how incredibly functional this system is. Our ability to automate higher order processes like riding a bike or throwing a basketball or football or whatever is one of the things that allows us to then move our conscious thought to some higher level. And so here you are at a university thinking about papers you want to write, or introspective exercises, or analytical papers, or writing research papers, or taking incredibly complicated organic chemistry tests, and you're dedicating your conscious thought to some stuff that's incredibly up there, right? And you don't even have to think about all these things that you've made automatic and non-conscious already, that other non-human animals would struggle to do at all. Unconscious thought has a large impact on behavior. That's what the Barge research and the Dijksterhuis research shows. Behavior that we believe to be completely controlled consciously, behaviors we believe to be completely controlled consciously are not, like speed of walking, how well you do on a trivia test. And all of this, taken together, challenges just how in control we really are, and poses that whole philosophical question of maybe consciousness is not really you being in control of this system, but rather is some kind of window in to all these processes that are actually going on outside of your control and non-consciously. And indeed, there's been a lot of really, really cool research on this. So, for example, Ellen Langer has done very interesting research on the illusion of control and how functional it is for us to have this feeling of control. That it's highly functional for us to believe that we are the rider that's directing the elephant. And that if we feel like we're not the rider directing the elephant, then we're not as healthy. She did this really interesting research where she gave elderly people in a retirement home a plant, or randomly gave some of them a plant to take care of and be in control of. And she found that those people that were given the plant to control and be responsible for and take care of reported better physical and mental health and actually lived longer than people who were not given a plant. So if you have elderly people in a nursing home, give them a plant. Why not? They would like it. I would. And then there's also research on the experience of will, on how what we experience as us causing things, us exerting willpower and changing phenomenon in our environment or affecting our environment. When we think that we've willed something to happen, that's actually an experience. It's not necessarily something that's totally scientifically true. It's something that we experience, and it can be easily tricked. So, for example, have you ever been in, I don't know, do you all still go to, like, arcades? This is an insulting question, right? You're like, I haven't been to an arcade since I was 11 years old or something. So you have been to an arcade? Who's been to, like, an arcade with, like, video games, Okay, all right, thank you, I appreciate that. None of you have, but you're being kind to me, trying to make me feel less old. So, in these arcades, people play video games, and they have fun, and they trade in their skee-ball tickets, which they spend $20 for, to get small stuffed animals that are worthless to them. But you want that stuffed animal so bad. It has a symbolic value well in excess, and all you were like, what the hell is skee-ball? What is he talking about? So, okay. So in arcades, have you ever gone up to an arcade game and started playing it for a while, and you're like, oh, sweet, somebody left a quarter in here, and you're playing it, and then halfway through you realize it's the demo, you know? Right? And you walk away and you're like, I knew that was a demo. And there's like some 8-year-old kid making fun of you to all of his friends, you know? So yeah, so in that, so that's like the experience of will, right? Like you're doing things, you have mental processes, you're trying to make things happen, and then you're seeing output in your environment. You're seeing something happen, and you imagine, you connect that, right? You make a link there. You say, my actions cause that reaction. But it's easily tricked, right? It's easily tricked by your utter and complete gullibility, you know? So what Dan Wegner, who's a social psychologist at Harvard University, which is a fancy pants private university which we won't necessarily make fun of, what Dan Wegner did was he tried to systematize this and say, how far can that go? And he did all these very creative studies where he would tell people, you know, play this game or do this thing while, with a mouse, and then they would actually reduce the extent to which you could control the mouse movements on the screen, and you would tend to exaggerate your feeling of will. So in any event, the point of this is that your willpower, your experience of will is an experience and can be tricked. Does it mean that the whole thing is bogus, that you're not causing your behaviors, that when you try to pull your pen out of your bag or send a text message or something like that, that it's not really you, that it's all a non-conscious process and you just have some sort of window into that that gives you the illusion of being in control of those behaviors? Nobody knows, and we probably never will know. And other research has shown that the self, the conscious controlled self, is a depletable resource. Remember I said that non-conscious, automatic, unconscious thought is fast, cheap, and out of control. Well, remember it's cheap, okay? You can do it all day. You know, you can do non-conscious processes all day, and they don't become particularly more cumbersome late in the day rather than earlier in the day. But what about conscious, controlled processes? What about trying to restrain yourself from temptation, like stop yourself from eating a big bag of ho-hos or something like that? You know? That's easy to do when you wake up, right? And you've got all this willpower and you start off the day, but then it gets later in the day and you can't even make yourself stop watching the shopping channel. And you hate the shopping channel. You hate it, you know? You're just eating ho-hos, watching the shopping channel. You know you are. You know you are. And we all are. It's one thing that connects us. We are all doing it. Don't feel shame. I feel shame because none of you do that. Okay, so, and you can't make yourself stop, right? Because you don't have any willpower left. You don't. You would want to, but you don't have it. So, okay. Point being that the conscious controlled self is a depletable resource, and it tires through exertion, and you can become exhausted and unable to override your automatic impulses as the day goes on. Your conscious mind is not fast, cheap, and out of control. It is not cheap. It's expensive. And when you use it on something, you'll have less of it later, which is one of these great dilemmas, a great dilemma of exercise and dieting, right? Is that, you know, when you make yourself exercise, you work really hard and make yourself exercise, and then you go like straight to a taqueria and get the beef, and then they say, do you want the sour cream and guacamole? And you're like, of course, I don't know why you even asked me that question, you know? Can't you see I've been exercising, you know? I'm powerless to resist this question, you know? Okay, so another conclusion. Unconscious thought may, unconscious thought may in some cases be better than conscious thought. That was the Apartment study by Dijksterhuis and company, or no, just Dijksterhuis. Okay, some unconscious quotes, some quotes related to unconsciousness. Sigmund Freud, the most complicated achievements of thought are possible without the assistance of consciousness. This is a long one. Albert Einstein. A human being is part of a whole called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. And this delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. And our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So, okay, so you turned in your introspective exercise. And now there's another one. So, The purpose of this exercise is for you not just to identify something to write about that fits the prompt. This is essentially the same prompt that you saw last Tuesday. The purpose of this exercise, to clarify it a little bit, we'll talk about the science behind it starting on Thursday. But the purpose is not just for you to identify something to write on and write on it, but it's to hopefully reappraise what you wrote about and write about it again, write about the same thing from a new, fresh perspective, and ideally come to maybe a more coherent or articulate way of viewing it. So I don't know about you, but like when I was doing this exercise last night, it was very late, and that was part of why mine was kind of inarticulate. But I realized I was writing on some subject that I didn't even think about very much. You know, I tried not to think about it. It was something I didn't like thinking about. And so as I went to go write about it, I was finding myself kind of gradually a little bit more in control of how I thought about it, if that makes sense. You know, as I was writing about it, it got a little bit more articulate. It started to make more sense the way I viewed it. At first, it was sort of a mess. I'll be totally honest with you. I was sort of a mess. So I was like on the floor trying to write, you know, like, I'm exaggerating. I wasn't that much of a mess. But in any event, my thoughts were very messy, and they got clearer over time. And that's kind of the idea. We'll talk more about what the purpose of this assignment is. But one of the ideas is for you to take something that you probably don't think about much, that bothers you, and own it, you know? Like, be in control of how you think about it. So that's what I want you to do, is exercise will on this task, revisit the same thing, and now own your perspective on it. Understand it more in the terms that you want to understand it in, not so much in the ways that you found you had understood it in. You know, if the prior exercise was kind of an archaeological expedition where you found and tried to uncover how do you understand this thing that you chose to write about, this would be more work of engineering, where now you're going to try to understand it in your terms, on your, you know, in the way that you would like to. People have asked, like, what if I'm kind of done writing about that, or what if it bothers me? Hey, you know, you're free on this assignment, you know. We're trusting you to do it. So you can explore your thoughts, you know, and go into different directions. I know I started writing about one thing and kind of wound up writing about something else. I might pick up the latter thread rather than the initial thread, and I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do. But I will also do this second assignment, which in my head you actually care about, but I don't think you really care about that. Okay, so here's the prompt. Respond to this prompt again with another short essay, this time 3 pages long. And again, for this assignment, I'd like you to write about your very deepest thoughts and feelings about an extremely important emotional issue that has affected you in your life, ideally the same one you already wrote about. In your writing, I'd like you to really let go and explore your very deepest emotions and thoughts. You might tie your topic to your relationships with others, including parents, lovers, friends, or relatives, to your past, your present, or your future, or to who you have been, who you would like to be, or who you are now. So remember, 3 type pages this time, not 2. Write on the same topic as before, ideally, or some related topic, unless you have some good reason, in which case we trust your reasons. And do this in either 1 or 2 sessions, your choice. Before I asked you to do it in 2 sessions, do it however you want now, 1 or 2 sessions. And again, include a cover page that has your name, and then we'll tear it off, and that's how we'll protect your anonymity. Okay? Are there any questions about this? There is an alternate assignment as well. Yeah. Single-spaced. Damn. God, no. If you think about it, you're so complicated. If I'd said double-spaced, that'd be an insult, you know? Right? 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 If you think about it. I'm flattering you. It's a compliment. It's a compliment. Okay. Okay, an alternate assignment. If for whatever reason you would prefer a different assignment, that's fine. That's great. Do it. It's also due next Tuesday, April 28th. Same bad time, same bad channel. Read the Love and Attachments chapter in the Happiness Hypothesis. It's a really, really awesome chapter that all of you have to read anyway, but read it like really closely for this assignment. And then write a 3-page response. Apply the ideas from the chapter to some experiences you've had in your life that you are comfortable writing about. And those could be relationships with parents, siblings, romantic partners, and so on. Are there any questions about the alternate assignment? So that's fine. If you want to offer that, that's great. Was there a question here? No? Great. Okay. Okay, so now we'll take like a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we'll come back and we will do a short quiz. So, question 1. Research on the police officer's dilemma investigates why African Americans, and here's the many choices. You have to write down the full answer of whatever choice you pick. Why African Americans employed as police officers are less corrupt than other police officers. Second option, are more often the victims of accidental police shootings. Third option, cooperate at higher rates in the prisoner's dilemma. Fourth option, are viewed as less hostile by male but not female police officers. I should say, make sure all your study aids and guides and things like that are away. Yes, question. There's 4 options here. Yes, you select one. Do not use this as an excuse to talk. Another question and no more questions. No, I don't. I want you to write out the full answer. Okay. All right, no more questions. Okay, so that's question 1. One of these is the right answer. Write that down. Okay. Question 2. Which of the following is a reason that stereotype threat impairs standardized test performance? This is from lecture in class. First, it increases long-term memory. 2, it primes the stereotype of the elderly. 3, it reduces working memory capacity. 4, don't write the number, write the thing. It decreases physiological arousal. Or last, it increases blood pressure. We'll go back and review, so we're going to move on now. Oh my God. Okay. I told you this quiz would be fun. This is hilarious. So far has been the most hilarious quiz ever. Okay. Question 3. Nisbet and Wilson's 1977 paper, Telling More Than We Can Know, is a paper associated with the idea that people first make accurate judgments about others based on thin slices, or have little insight into the causes of their behavior, or are usually rational, logical, and deliberate. Okay. Question number 4. In Dijksterhuis and von Nippenberg, 1996, how did priming participants with the concept of professor affect performance in a game of Trivial Pursuit? Did it improve it, impair it, or have no effect? One of these 3 options. Question 5. According to Timothy Wilson, in Chapter 1 of Strangers to Ourselves, modern psychologists were reluctant to study the unconscious because of its association with what famous scholar? René Descartes, Sigmund Freud, B.F. Skinner, or Thomas Hobbes? Okay. The last question, question 6. What is the central idea of Chapter 10 of Jonathan Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis? Happiness comes from within. Happiness comes from consciousness. Happiness comes from between. Or happiness comes from exercise. I don't know. I just had to come up with one. Yeah. It's multiple choice test. Quiz. Okay. Does anybody need to see one of these again? Okay, we'll go through all of them again. Okay. Okay. Please keep your eyes on your paper or on the screen. Research on the police officer's dilemma investigates why African Americans employed as police officers are less corrupt, are more often the victims of accidental police shootings, cooperate at higher rates in the prisoner's dilemma, or are viewed as less hostile by male, but not female, police officers. One of these is right, and the other ones aren't. To clarify. Okay. 2. Which of the following is a reason that stereotype threat impairs standardized test performance? Is it because stereotype threat increases long-term memory, primes the stereotype of the elderly, reduces working memory capacity, decreases physiological arousal, or increases blood pressure? The answer to this was in lecture, stereotypes lecture. Question 3, Nisbin-Wilson's Telling More Than We Can Know is a paper that is associated with the idea that people either make accurate judgments about others based on thin slices, have little insight into the causes of their behavior, or are usually rational, logical, and deliberate. Fourth question, in those guys' paper, how did priming participants with the concept of professor affect performance in Trivial Pursuit? Did it improve it, impair it, or have no effect? Moving on. Question 5, according to Timothy Wilson, modern psychologists were reluctant to study the unconscious because it was associated with a famous scholar. Who was that scholar? Was it Descartes, Freud, Skinner, or Hobbes? Question 6, what's the central idea of Chapter 10 of Haidt's happiness hypothesis? Is it that happiness comes from within, that it comes from consciousness, comes from between, or comes from exercise? Yes. 3. Telling More Than We Can Know is a paper associated with which of these 3 ideas? Any last requests? That didn't mean that to sound so morbid. 2, again. Again with number 2. No. Okay, all right, yes. Fine. Okay, that's the last you see, number 3. This is number 2. Shh. Okay? There is a time aspect to this. Okay. That's all the time you get. Question number 4. Okay. We are now done with this quiz. Please take the sheet of paper that you have written your answers on, pass it to the ends of the aisles. If you're in the middle section up here, go that way. If you're in the middle of an aisle, I have no idea what you should do. We'll come up with something. I'm sorry. It's not right. It's not right. Please do not take the quiz and then immediately leave the class. Okay, do you have a quiz that has not been picked up? Please raise your hand if you have a quiz that has not been picked up. If you have a quiz that has not been picked up, can you raise your hand? There's some there. Hey, Nora, there's some back there. Or Kristen. Okay, so we got them all. We're good? We got them all? Okay, then let's stop talking. Man, you people that are leaving are irritating me. Okay. There, you've been guilt-tripped. That'll show them. See if they enjoy their afternoon now. They won't, but you will. Okay. So, now we're going to talk about another class of non-conscious behavior. Non-conscious influences on behavior. We're going to talk about behavioral mimicry. This is some of my favorite stuff. People are like slamming doors to get out of here. They're just like, please, God, get me out into the sun. I can't take it. And it is pretty bad. I mean, it's pretty bad in here. You know, you're learning about social psychology. You're acing quizzes. I mean, I can understand why you would flee. So, mimicry research. So, mimicry is defined for our purposes as the tendency of people to imitate one another's behavior. Misspelled, sorry about that. In other words, act like lemmings. Have you heard this expression, act like lemmings? You know this? Do you know? You know? Really? Really? Who has heard the act like lemmings thing? Okay, all right, there's some of us. So they act like lemmings. What is this a reference to? Does anyone know? A video game? I don't even know that video. Oh, yeah, I've heard of that video game. Right. There is an urban legend that says that lemmings ritualistically kill themselves by running in a giant pack off a cliff together. That this weird idea. As it turns out, I believe that this is not true. But ironically, well, I don't know if it's ironic, but hysterically, Disney actually ran a ton of lemmings off of a hill for a nature documentary they were making in like the 1950s. And they were like, man, these lemmings never really do this. How are we going to make our nature documentary about lemmings doing this? Oh, we'd better like force them off of a cliff. and film it happening and be like, isn't it terrible the way the lemmings kill themselves, you know? And it's actually like Mickey Mouse with a broom back there, you know? Like, I know, it's terrible. I apologize. Okay. Don't blame me, blame Disney, who probably owns the state of California now and is probably going to have me fired by Thursday. So mimicry is sort of the heart of research on nonverbal behavior. People are very, very interested in mimicry, and it's very interesting. And recent research on mimicry has highlighted the possible role, cognitive role, of mirror neurons in your prefrontal cortex in instigating mimicry. Because this is a social psychology class, we won't talk about that. You can get that in a neuroscience class or a cog-sci class, perhaps. Instead, we're going to talk about social factors that impact mimicry and social dimensions of mimicry. Any of you? I usually get like 10 people with that, man. You getting it? Yeah. It's pretty bad, right? Yawning is contagious. I got a couple of you. That's not bad. That's not that bad. Yawning is very contagious. You look at somebody yawn, you want to yawn. I don't know why. It's some kind of, subtle suggestion. Another one that's a good one, if you're in a lecture hall and you're like waiting to take an exam or something, don't do this, for my exams, but possibly someone else's. Cough. Cough or clear your throat, and you'll find it'll like spark. There'll be like all these coughs. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. I think it's because people kind of want to cough, but they don't. They don't feel like they can. It's not really socially acceptable. There's been a higher rate of coughing since I said cough, by the way. Have you noticed that? There have been like 2 coughs in like 3 seconds after I said it. So in any event, these are obvious illustrations of the fact that nonverbal behaviors are highly contagious. Verbal behaviors are as well. Have you ever had the experience of going home or talking to a friend of yours who has a certain accent and you find yourself taking on that accent? Have you had this? Yep. I do this all the time, and it makes me feel like I have no self or integrity or something. It makes me feel ridiculous. And I'll go, back home to the South and be like, that's like the craziest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. That's like, I'm just like a completely different person. And there's nothing I can do about it. I can't control it. Or I'll go to Kansas. My brothers live in Kansas, and they have these like Kansas drawls, and I'll find myself talking like them, and there's nothing I can do about it. I don't want to, and I'm watching myself. It's like an out-of-body experience where I know I'm doing it, but I can't stop. It's like I can't remember how to normally talk. It's really weird. Yeah. Yes, so Mythbusters did this very interesting thing on whether yawning is contagious. They did a very nice controlled experiment on this, actually, where they yawned at people while giving them like a quiz and then putting them in isolation rooms, and which is really, really similar to the way a social psychologist would do this study, and then measured, whether they then yawned. They snuck a video camera into the isolation room, and it didn't go very well. It was sort of went surprisingly poorly, I'd say. Like, there was a very, very low rate of yawning being contagious, and then they totally bungled their statistics and thought it was a significant rate, and they've just been crucified on the internet by statistically savvy people who are like, that's no way to calculate the t-value, that p coefficient, you're ridiculous. And they're like, we have no idea what you're talking about. Lay off. Yeah, so maybe fake yawns aren't as contagious? Is that the idea? I know, but I was trying to make it, I did my best, I'm sorry. So research on mimicry has kind of exploded over the last 7 years or so. Like this automaticity boom happened like 15 years ago, and then this mimicry boom sort of happened like 7 years ago as people got very interested in mimicry, probably because lemmings are so cute. So, and what they often call this is the chameleon effect. And as you might guess, Tanya Chartrand and this old customer, John Barge, did the first kind of big study on the chameleon effect. Why is it called the chameleon effect? Because chameleons change their colors to blend in with their environment. They mimic their environment. And in this paper, Chartrand and Barge argue that behavioral mimicry is based on a perception-behavior link, that you perceive something and it tends to activate a behavior because perception has some sort of direct effect on behavior. And it's a very, very familiar idea, right? Because that's what we were finding in the priming studies. You're primed with the concept of the elderly, you walk slower. There's an immediate perception to behavior connection or link. So in order to demonstrate this, this is what they did. They conducted a study not so unlike the Mythbusters study. Okay, so study 1. Participants worked on 2 sessions of a photo description task with 2 Confederates. And they worked for like 10 minutes with one Confederate and then 10 minutes with the other. And it was like this bogus task where they were describing the contents of photographs and with the person. They take turns. And so you'd say, oh, this photograph is really cool. It's really well taken. It feels very warm. I don't know. And then the Confederate says something that they've been instructed to say the same thing every time. And what they did was they had the Confederates either rub their faces during the task or, I'm looking, not really. Okay. Or shake their foot, you know? And now you're all shaking your feet. Yeah. So they either shook their foot or rubbed their faces. And these are totally contagious phenomena. I encourage you to do this to people around you and instigate their face rubbing. It's very interesting. You can make this happen. And then the foot shaking thing is big. That one definitely works. Probably my favorite one is crossing your arms. You know, if you cross your arms, the person you talk to, I swear to God, at a much higher rate will try to cross their arms as well. And then you can even uncross your arms and see what happens then. And then before you know it, they're just a puppet on your strings. You know, you're controlling everything they do. It's a beautiful thing. So, okay, so they had Confederates also either smile or not smile and try to see if that was contagious as well. Though that one's a little bit different, right? Because if you smile and then the person you're with smiles, it could be that just smiling just signals friendliness and happiness, and then when somebody's friendly and happy interacting with you, you want to act more friendly. It's not really direct perception behavior link. It could be, you know, just friendly signaling, which would be a little bit different. But anyway, so here are the results of the study. Participants smiled more times per minute when the Confederate generally smiled than when she or he did not. So when the Confederate was smiling, they smiled about 1 time a minute. When they weren't smiling at all, they smiled about 1/3 of a time a minute. And the same effect for face rubbing. When somebody was rubbing their face, they videotaped this later and coded, you know, how much did the participant rub their face in turn. And if the Confederate had been rubbing their face and the participant rubbed their face like, you know, 0.6 times a minute versus 0.35 times a minute, and the same for foot shaking. If the Confederate shook their foot, then it led the participant to shake their foot like, you know, about 3/4 of a time a minute versus a 1/2 time a minute if the Confederate didn't shake their foot. So that's a nice, clean demonstration of behavioral mimicry, right, across a set of 3 different behaviors: smiling, foot shaking, and face rubbing. Okay. So then they conducted a follow-up study, same task. You're sitting there with a Confederate doing the photo description task. The Confederate, in this case, mimics you. They either do or do not mimic your nonverbal behavior. Let's say you're a participant in this study. So the Confederate's instructed to mimic you or not mimic you. And then after the study, you, or you know, whatever, the participants in the study, are asked to rate how much they liked the Confederate and how smoothly the interaction went. And here they're testing this idea that mimicry maybe serves a purpose or a function. So it greases the wheels of interaction, facilitates people getting along with one another, feeling cohesive, and liking one another. So here's what they found. Results supported their predictions. Participants reported liking a Confederate more when she or he mimicked them. And participants also thought the interaction went smoother when they were mimicked. And when they later coded videotapes, it showed that the Confederates in the 2 conditions were equally friendly, because that was one thing they were worried about. Maybe when we're instructing this Confederate to mimic the participant, they're also being nicer to them, friendlier, smiling more, or something like that. They checked that. That wasn't a concern. They just mimicked or didn't mimic, and that produced more cohesion and liking. Any questions about this? So if you have a mind like Bob Cialdini's, he would say, okay, well, you should be using mimicry to your advantage, right? Like that means if you're trying to create cohesion and liking with somebody, maybe mimic what they're saying and doing. There's a question there. I can't hear her. I can't. Yes. Yeah, the reason, I don't know why the Mythbusters did the thing where they isolated the people after yawning at them, but I think they did it so they could run a bunch of people really quick. You know, like you come into the lab, I yawn at you, put you in an isolation room, another person does, boom, boom, boom. You can run like, you know, 10 every 30 minutes or something. I think that's why they did it. I don't know. Yes, okay. So, study 3 on the chameleon effect, they predicted that empathic people People who take the perspective of other people will mimic more. Here I should clarify, there are two meanings of empathy in the psychology literature. One definition of empathy is caring about other people, being concerned about whether they're doing well or if they're hurt or something like that. That's a very conventional definition of empathy. Another one is more perspective taking. To what extent do you take the perspective of other people? Which was like the conflict exercise that you did early in the class, where you were encouraged to take the perspective of someone else, walk in their moccasins, if you will. That's a dispositional tendency. Some people naturally do that a fair amount, and some people naturally never do it. And those are the people I get into arguments with. So they predicted that empathic people who take the perspective of others will mimic more, which sort of makes sense, right? They're attending more closely to other people's behaviors, perspectives, and thoughts. So maybe they're more likely to take on those perspectives, behaviors, and thoughts. And, right, because taking the perspective of the other involves paying close attention to others, thinking about their thoughts, but perhaps also behaving the way that they do. And the results were, the prediction was confirmed. People who are more empathic, who take the perspective of other, mimic more, which is interesting, I think. Okay. Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am. They have like a standard inventory, like a battery, a psychometric battery, a personality inventory, and you answer a bunch of questions that are like, you know, like to what extent do you take the perspective of other people and stuff like that, you know. Yeah, they're probably a little cleverer than that, but I bet you that's almost exactly one of them, yeah. But they'll ask like 8 questions, and then from that they'll compose an average score that isn't reliant on your answer to any one question. Okay, here's another study on mimicry. I like this one. This one's interesting. Van Baren et al., 2003. These people are Dutch, where they do all this cool automaticity research. And they trained servers in restaurants to repeat back to customers orders to them word for word or not. So they would either say, you know, when they got an order like, you know, oh, so you want the chicken salad with the, you know, the lettuce on the side and then the mayonnaise and then you want that dressing and whatever. You know, you say exactly the way they said it. Back to them, or you just say, you know, I got the order, no problem. And what they found was that those who verbally mimicked the customers received significantly greater tips. So this is a good, you know, use this in your everyday life to get bigger tips. Should you be a server? If you're not, it's probably not going to work. And of course, this is consistent with the earlier findings that mimicry increases feelings of cohesion, right? That when you have been mimicked, then you feel greater cohesion with the person. So this begs a question of, are all behaviors mimicked? Are there any kind of behaviors where we don't tend to mimic other people? And Laura Tiedens and Fergal in 2003 decided to investigate this question. This is Laura Tiedens, and she's an organizational behavior professor. There's actually a substantial set of social psychology that goes on not in sociology departments, not in psychology departments, but actually in organizational behavior departments in business schools. And Laura Tiedens is one of these people. So she asked the question, are all behaviors mimicked? And she said that perhaps some behaviors tend to instigate their opposites. Perhaps it's the case that there's a complementarity process where people will tend to non-verbally adopt the complementary non-verbal behavior. Yeah, outside of awareness, they'll take on the they'll take on the complementary non-verbal behavior. Now, what am I talking about? Well, okay. So for all the stuff we've looked at so far with mimicry, these behaviors, they don't have any association with hierarchy or status or anything like that. But certain nonverbal behaviors do. So for example, they found, this is a funny one I think, they found that chin thrusting is highly related to, hey, can you all stop talking for a second time? The two of you. Thank you. They found that chin thrusting, which is a behavior you see like cats and dogs and non-human animals do all the time to like sort of stake out higher ground and stuff when they're fighting with one another. They found that chin thrusts, right, tend to intimidate people. You're all very terrified right now because I'm chin thrusting you. That makes sense. That's natural. Don't be alarmed. That's how it works. And I can tell you, when I was growing up in the South, there was this huge difference. You'd be walking on the street, you run into a stranger, and there's a huge difference between going like this and going like that, you know? You go like that. That means something very different where I come from. And I actually had an experience. You all know who George Stephanopoulos is? It's George Stephanopoulos. I ran into him at an airport one time, and I was sitting around waiting for my flight to Ithaca, New York, and he was coming back from some flight, and he had like 2 handlers with him because he's a very important political man. He's also a shorter man, and he has his handlers with him, and he was walking past, and I was like, oh, crap, that's George Stephanopoulos. You know, it's like this famous guy. I never see famous people in airports, like, ever, you know. And everybody else says I never do. I saw this one guy from 30 Rock one time. That was cool, too. So anyway, so I was, so he's going by, and I'm like, I want to tell him, I see you, George, you know, but I'm cool with you. I'm not going to out you. I'm not going to, don't worry. And so I give him a little chin thrust, give him one of these, and son of a gun, George went like that. Yeah? Okay? All right? So should any of you need internships in DC or something, I got a lot of juice there now because I own George, and he knows this.